Montana Territory, late autumn, 1883. The wind was sharp, the sky bruised with storm, and Owen Vaughn had not expected to find a child hiding behind his sorrel mare. He had just come back from riding fence, boots heavy with mud, coat stiff with sleet. The sun was low, bleeding orange across the hills. His ranch lay quiet, the valley still except for the sound of restless hooves and the gusts that rattled the old barn doors. Then the mare whinnied not her usual greeting, but something startled. Owen stepped into the corral, eyes narrowing. That was when he saw her. A little girl, no more than 4 or 5, crouched against the far post, arms wrapped around her knees, clutching a ragged doll to her chest. Her cheeks were streaked with dirt and tears. Her dress was too thin for the weather, the hem torn. But it was her eyes that froze him in place, wide, frightened, locked on him like a deer about to bolt. "Hey," he said gently, hands up, voice low. "It's all right. You're safe here." She didn't move. Owen knelt slowly, careful not to spook her. "My name's Owen," he said. "You hungry?" Still, no answer. The wind cut through his shirt, but he stayed there. "I got warm stew inside. You can have all you want. Even some cornbread." The girl blinked. Her lips trembled. Then, soft as a whisper, she said, "My mama's hurt." Owen stood fast, heart thudding. "Where is she?" The child pointed toward the woods past the ridge, where his property met the old wagon road. He grabbed his coat and rifle, lifted the girl into his arms. She was light as a bundle of sticks, and saddled his gelding. She clung to him, her face tucked into his chest, shivering. They found the woman 20 minutes later, barely conscious, curled beneath a pine with snow dusting her skirt. Her hair was matted, her face pale, a gash on her temple still bleeding. She had pulled her coat over her daughter before collapsing. Owen slid from the saddle and dropped to his knees. "Ma'am," he said, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. Her pulse fluttered. "You hear me?" She stirred, blinked up at him, her lips dry and cracked. "Paige," she rasped. "She's safe," he said quickly. "I've got her." Relief softened her face even as pain twisted it. She tried to sit up and failed. "Do not move," Owen said. "You're hurt. Let me help." She did not argue. Her strength was gone. He carried her across the saddle, held steady by one arm, Paige in the other. The ride back was slow and brutal, every bump jarring her. Inside the cabin, he laid her on his bed, wrapped her in warm quilts, and stoked the fire higher. He cleaned the cut, checked her ribs as best he could. Nothing broken, but bruised, and badly. She drifted in and out through the night. Paige curled on the floor beside the hearth, her small hand tight around his shirt sleeve while he sat on the rug, watching the woman breathe. By morning, her fever had broken. She opened her eyes and saw him. For a long moment neither spoke. Then she said, voice still hoarse, "Thank you?" He nodded. "I am glad you are alive." She tried to sit up again. This time, he helped her. "You have a name?" he asked. She studied him, the worn lines of his face, the scar across his brow, the shadows under his eyes. "Harriet," she said softly. "Harriet Vale." Owen felt something shift in his chest. Not sharp. Just something. He glanced down at Paige, still asleep against his leg. "What happened?" Harriet looked away. "Wagon broke an axle. 2 days back. My husband's gone. Buried him last winter." Her voice cracked. "I tried to get us to my cousin's farm in Helena. We didn't make it." Owen did not ask more. He just nodded again and stood, poured her a cup of coffee and brought it to her. She took it with shaking hands. "You live out here all alone?" "Used to run cattle with my brother. He died in the war. Been just me since." He looked down at his hands. "I do not talk much anymore." Harriet lifted her eyes to his. "Then do not talk. Just let us stay a while. Until I can walk again. You can stay as long as you need." Her mouth trembled. "Thank you?" He looked down at her, the curve of her cheek, the quiet strength in her voice, even now. Something warm pushed against the cold he had carried for so many years. Later that day, he found Paige standing at the corral fence, watching the horses. He came up beside her. "Do you like them?" he asked. She nodded, thumb in her mouth. "You can name one if you want." She pointed. "That one." "The brown one with the white tail." "That is Daisy." Paige smiled, just a little. Owen crouched beside her. "You and your mama are safe now. You do not have to run anymore." She looked at him, then reached out and took his hand. He held it gently, and for the first time in years, Owen felt something light begin to stir in his chest again. Not joy. Not yet. But maybe hope. And when he looked back toward the cabin, through the open door where Harriet sat wrapped in a quilt, watching them with tired but grateful eyes, he saw something there too. Something that made the cold inside him finally start to thaw. The first snow held off, but the cold deepened. Owen kept to chopping wood and mending what needed it, but his eyes often drifted back to the cabin. Something in him had shifted, though he had no name for it. Inside, Harriet moved slowly, her steps cautious but steadier each day. She kept quiet company, not one to fill silence with needless words. She sat near the window when the sun was up, sewing torn seams in Paige's dress with a needle he hadn't used since his mother passed. Her hands were deft, though her knuckles bore the roughness of years worked hard. One morning, he came in from the shed with a box of old tools and found her beside the stove, sleeves rolled, boiling water with a bundle of herbs laid out on the table. "What's that?" he asked, wiping his boots and stepping over Paige's scattered wooden animals on the floor. "Yarrow, willow bark, and linden," she said without looking up. "For the swelling in my ribs. I learned from a woman back in Kansas. Her boy came home from Shiloh full of pain." Nothing worked but this. Owen nodded once, watching the steam rise. "You think it'll help?" It always did. He leaned against the door frame, arms folded. "I've still got laudanum. If it gets worse, I'd rather not." She met his eyes then. "Too easy to forget yourself in it." He didn't argue. He understood that temptation too well. Paige stirred in her corner, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Harriet crossed the room, knelt beside her, and brushed her hair back with calloused fingers. The child leaned into the touch without a word. Owen turned away and stoked the fire. "There's a patch of winter wheat I never harvested. If you're feeling up to it, might be worth checking on. Could be rabbits or worse in it." Harriet stood slowly. "I'll come." They walked the field together, Paige riding slung over Owen's hip, one arm looped around his neck. She didn't speak, but her small fingers clung tight to the fabric of his coat. Harriet's steps were stiff, but she kept pace. Her eyes scanned the frost-bitten stalks with the same caution he used to read cattle. "I was raised on dry land," she said after a while. "The kind that breaks beneath your feet if you walk wrong." Owen looked over. "Whereabouts?" "Near Council Grove." She said it like it was a name she hadn't spoken in years. "Father tried wheat. Failed at it. Tried wool after. That went worse." "What brought you west?" She hesitated. "A man who believed he could do better. He was kinder than most. Didn't drink. Taught me to shoot. Died last spring from a fever." Owen nodded once, not to fill the silence, but to mark it with understanding. They reached the edge of the field. A low rustle in the brush sent his hand to the rifle slung across his back, but it was just a hare, bounding off into the scrub. "Still got life out here," Harriet said, shading her eyes against the pale morning light. "Not much, but enough." Paige tugged his collar. "Can we keep the rabbit?" He chuckled low in his throat. "Not today, little one." Back at the cabin, Harriet rinsed the herbs and laid them to dry beside the stove. Owen brought in the last of the kindling. The coals glowed steady, casting warm light on the plank walls and the worn floorboards. That evening, Harriet handed him a bowl thick with stew. He took it, surprised by the flavor, earthy, rich, something he hadn't tasted in years. "You made this?" She nodded, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Your dried beans were still good. The rest was what I had left in my satchel." He took a slow bite, then set the bowl down between them. "You ever think about staying put?" Her fingers stilled in her lap. Paige was already curled beneath a quilt on the cot, fast asleep. "I did," she said. "Before the world fell out from under me." He met her gaze. "Sometimes it comes back slower than we think." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You talk like a man who's been waiting on something." "I suppose I have." They sat there a long while. The fire crackled low, and outside, the wind had settled. Harriet didn't look away from him, and he didn't look away from her. "I don't know what comes next," she said finally. "Then you're not alone in that." And in the quiet that followed, something passed between them, not sudden, not spoken, but real. A thread drawn taut, holding steady, unbreaking. Owen reached for the bowl again and took another bite. "You cook like someone who's survived worse than cold winters." Harriet's mouth turned up, just a little. "Maybe I have." He didn't need to say more. He just sat with her close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and let the silence hold what words could not. By the second week, Harriet had taken over the mornings. Owen no longer rose to the scent of untouched coffee and cold hearth. Instead, he found biscuits baking, Paige humming soft nonsense to herself as she stacked wooden buttons in crooked towers on the table, and Harriet standing in her stocking feet near the fire, brushing out her hair with the care of someone finally unhurried. She had found his mother's old brush in a drawer near the washbasin. He hadn't touched it in years. Now it passed gently through strands the color of riverbed stone, the motion quiet and rhythmic. "You sure you want to keep on with that plow?" she asked one morning as he lugged the iron thing from the shed. He paused, brushing a layer of frost off the handle. "What else would I use?" "Well," she said, wiping flour from her fingers, "your soil's too shallow near the creek. That's why your roots die out early. You should move your rows uphill, near that patch of bee balm." He blinked at her. "You know about planting?" "I know what doesn't work," she said. "That's worth something." He didn't argue. Instead, he turned and looked toward the slope she'd mentioned. He hadn't thought of it before. It held water longer. Faced east. "All right," he said. "I'll shift the beds tomorrow." "Good," she said, and went back to kneading dough. When the wind calmed that afternoon, they walked beyond the split rail fence, where the land opened up into golden brush and cottonwood groves going bare. Paige trailed behind, gathering pale leaves into her apron. Harriet carried a canvas sack over one shoulder, filled with scraps and twine for kindling bundles. "You always do this much walking?" Owen asked, watching her navigate a narrow deer path. "When I can," she said. "Motion keeps the pain from settling." He walked beside her, careful not to crowd her steps. "You miss Kansas?" "No," she said plainly. "But I miss the sound of frogs at night. And thunder that rolls slow across the flat land. I don't remember much of back east," he said. "Just the smell of coal smoke. And boots on wood floorboards, always someone leaving." She looked over at him. "Was it hard to stay still again after the war?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Took me years to let the silence be quiet, not dangerous." She didn't speak after that. Just walked with him through the brittle grass, breathing in the dry, clean air. When they returned, Paige was asleep on Harriet's shoulder, her little hand tangled in the woman's collar. Owen reached out without thinking and took the sack from Harriet, carrying it back inside while she settled the child on the cot. Later that evening, Harriet sat at the table with a piece of muslin stretched across her knee, stitching something small and careful. Owen leaned against the wall, watching the needle dip and rise. "What are you making?" he asked. "A doll's apron," she said. "Paige's is torn across the hem. She won't ask for another." "She always that quiet?" "She listens more than she speaks." "That's her way." He nodded, then looked at the fire. "Folks always said I was too quiet to marry." Never knew what to say to a woman. That's not the trouble, Harriet said, threading a new length of cotton. Most men talk too much. They think women want answers. We don't. We want to be seen. He looked at her then, the flicker of firelight catching at her throat, her hands, the curve of her jaw where it met her neck. I see you. For a long while, she didn't answer. Then she said, I know. When he rose to check the latch on the door, she stood too. Wait, she said, and crossed the room, holding something in her palm. He opened his hand, and she placed a small cloth square in it. A stitched horse, rough but clear, with crooked legs and a short tail. For Paige, she said, but I thought you might like to give it to her yourself. He looked down at the soft cotton, the tiny red stitches. You made this today? While you were chopping wood. I had time. He looked up. Thank you? She hesitated, then brushed her fingers against his. It's nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Not to him. That night, as snow whispered against the windows, Owen lay awake on the floor beside the hearth, listening to the soft breathing of the two people who'd changed the shape of his days. He didn't know what word to put to it not yet, but in the quiet, he felt it growing. Not chance. Not debt. Something earned, and still unfolding. The days shortened in a quiet way, drawing the light down earlier with each dusk. Snow settled in the hollows now, not deep yet, but enough to muffle sound and mark the line where fall had ended and winter took hold. Owen fitted a second flue to the chimney and tacked canvas over the north-facing windows, his breath fogging in the cold as he worked. Inside, Harriet had shifted the cot closer to the fire and made a thick mattress for Paige from the hides Owen kept stored in the loft. She sewed late into the evenings by lantern light, her shoulders hunched, eyes narrowed not from fatigue, but from focus. She never asked for help, and that stillness about her, the one that had first struck him like a held breath, had begun to change. Not softened, exactly, but opened. Where did you learn to stitch like that? Owen asked one evening, watching her fingers move with practiced precision as she hemmed a pair of trousers too long for Paige but still years from being outgrown. She didn't glance up. From a neighbor when I was 12. She had one arm and 6 children. Said hands weren't the only way to hold things together. That sounds like a woman worth listening to. She was. Most folks weren't. He leaned his elbow on the table, tapping a knuckle absently against the wood. You ever think about teaching? You're quick with your hands. Patient with Paige. I taught letters to the mill children back in Missouri. Before I married. They paid me in eggs and tobacco. She tied off a knot with her teeth. I never thought I'd miss it, but I do. The order of it. The way a child's face changes when they understand something for the first time. Owen studied her, then looked toward the hearth, where Paige lay curled with her doll tucked beneath her chin. Helena's got a schoolhouse. Too many children, not enough desks. You think I'd fit there? She asked. A widow with no land and a child born on the road? He didn't answer right away. Then, you fit here. She met his eyes, the needle still in her hand. That's not the same. No, he said. It's not. The silence stretched, but didn't strain. She returned to her work, and he reached for the kettle to pour her a cup of the chicory she'd started steeping in the mornings. It wasn't coffee, but it warmed the same. The next day, they found a frozen calf near the western fence line. Owen bundled it in burlap, carried it back in his arms with Harriet walking beside him, breaking the crusted snow with her boots. You'll lose more if the weather turns fast, she said, brushing the frost from the calves' ears once they'd settled it in the barn. I know. I've got hay stacked, but not enough for every head. She rested her hand on the post. You could sell the unbranded yearlings. Trade them for grain and cloth. He glanced at her. You think I'd get a fair deal for that? Not unless I go with you. He raised a brow, and she added, I've traded in worse towns. I can read a man's price before he says it. He nodded once. Then we'll ride to town when the road's clear. She stepped outside the barn, breath rising like smoke in the sharp air. I haven't been in a town since before Paige could walk. Don't worry, he said. I'll be beside you. She didn't smile, but her eyes stayed on his a moment longer than they needed to. That night, after Paige had fallen asleep, Harriet reached into her trunk and pulled out a wooden box, worn smooth at the corners. She placed it on the table between them. I want you to see something, she said. He opened the lid slowly. Inside were folded letters, a faded ribbon, and a tintype of a man in a Union uniform, younger than Owen had expected, with a jaw like hers and the same steady look behind the eyes. My brother, she said. He died at Cold Harbor. I kept his likeness to remind me of what we survive. Owen touched the edge of the frame with care. You talk about him like he's still with you. In some ways, he is. He taught me not to wait on the world to fix itself. Owen looked up at her, the firelight running gold along her cheek. You've done more than wait. She closed the box gently. So have you? The air between them held a kind of hush, not from fear or uncertainty, but from something deepening. Not rushed. Not named. Outside, the wind picked up again, but it didn't sound so sharp this time. Just steady. Like something carrying them forward. The trail to town broke open beneath the sleet, wagon ruts turned brittle and white with packed snow. They waited 3 more days for the worst of it to pass. When they finally rode out, Harriet rode Owen's smaller dun mare. Paige nestled snug in a sling across her chest, her nose tucked under a wool scarf. The town of Twin Forks sat low between hills, smoke rising from stovepipes and the sound of a blacksmith's hammer ringing faintly through the air. A few wagons lined the general store, and the saloon's porch held a man half drowsing in a chair, boots up, rifle across his lap. Nothing about the place was unfamiliar to Owen, but he watched Harriet closely as they dismounted. She didn't hesitate, just adjusted Paige's weight and squared her shoulders. They stepped inside the store together, the warmth of the potbelly stove brushing their cheeks. Owen greeted the shopkeeper, a man named Merrill with salt-thick hair and a ledger always tucked under one arm. Looking to trade, Owen said, setting down a sack of dried apple and the hide-wrapped bundle of rabbit pelts Harriet had prepared. Merrill gave a nod, eyes drifting to Harriet, then to Paige, then back. Prices'll be lean today. Stagecoaches late with the flour, and the Smiths took the last of the lamp oil. Harriet stepped forward. We're not here for flour. Merrill's brow lifted. We need coarse wool, a spool of waxed thread, and 2 pounds of barley seed. I saw the sack split on your back shelf, half the grain's already dry. You'll be losing it by week's end. Merrill stared. We'll take it for the pelts and 2 jars of preserved peaches, she added. If you've got any left. Owen said nothing. The quiet that followed stretched only a moment before Merrill gave a grunt and started measuring the barley. Once they'd packed their goods, Owen led her to the livery where he settled the mare and checked the gelding's girth. Harriet stood beside him, Paige dozing now under the layered shawl. You always speak that plain to folks? He asked. She glanced up at him. If I wait to be asked, I'll wait forever. He smiled, not wide, just enough to crease the weathered skin below his eyes. You want to stop at the Smiths? You mentioned needing pins for the loom. I'd rather go home, she said. Paige is heavy, and it's colder here than I thought. They rode back under a sky turning soft with cloud, the snow light again but steady. Owen noticed the way Harriet leaned slightly into the wind, shielding the child with her shoulder. He thought of asking if she wanted to rest, but didn't. She'd say so if she did. That night, after Paige had been laid to sleep, Owen sat carving a new yoke pin at the table. Harriet walked past him, her hand brushing his shoulder without thought. He paused. I've been thinking, she said, untying her boots near the hearth. If we're to plant uphill like we planned, we'll need more hands come spring. And more seed. I can ask Levi from across the ridge, Owen replied. He owes me 2 days' work. She nodded. And I've been saving the muslin scraps. If I piece them right, I can make Paige a dress come Easter. He set the blade down and turned toward her. You speak like you've already decided to stay. She met his gaze, then sat beside him. I have. He reached across the table, his fingers closing gently around hers. I hoped you would. Her hand tightened slightly in his. You ever think there's a kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty anymore? He looked at her, the firelight softening the edge of her jaw, the lines earned from weather and years and grief. I think I found it, he said. She leaned forward then, not rushed, just steady and sure, and when he met her halfway, the kiss was warm and certain and without ceremony. It wasn't their first moment of closeness, but it was the first made in full light, with no shadows left between them. They rose early the next morning, side by side, Harriet at the stove, Owen checking the frost against the far window. When Paige woke, she pattered across the floor in her wool socks and climbed into Owen's lap without a word. He held her against his chest, her breath warmed through his shirt, and Harriet turned from the stove to see them framed there in the morning light. She didn't speak. Just watched the shape of them, the way Paige's small hand curled against Owen's collarbone, the way he rested his chin gently against her head. And she knew then, without question, that this was not a place they were passing through. It was home. Years later, the cabin stretched with additions, an extra room with a real door for Paige, a lean-to for the loom Harriet used each winter, the porch deepened to hold 2 chairs and a rough-built swing. The wheat grew strong on the eastern slope, and the orchard they planted behind the barn bore fruit by the 5th summer. Harriet taught again, once a week at the schoolhouse in Twin Forks, riding in on the dun mare with Paige's tucked into her satchel. Paige helped in the garden and learned to read by the fire, her curls always falling into her eyes. Owen never said much more than needed, but his hands stayed steady, his presence constant as the land itself. He built a cradle when Harriet's belly grew round again, and held her hand through the long hours of labor when their second daughter came into the world on a rain-washed April night. They named her June. In the evenings, when the work was done and the girls were tucked beneath quilts Harriet had pieced herself, Owen and Harriet sat on the porch, their fingers laced together, the sun dying slow and golden over the hills. They did not speak often of the road that brought them there. They didn't need to. It lived in the way he brushed her hair back when the wind caught it, in the way she set his coffee beside him each morning without asking how he'd slept, in the way Paige curled between them on quiet nights and June learned to laugh first at her father's silent smile. They grew old together in that place. Not quickly, not all at once. Just steadily, like roots drawing deep into good soil. And they were happy. Truly, quietly, wholly happy.